June 4, 1943, Mexia, Texas. When the first prisoners of the Africa Corps stepped down from the wagons, many still firmly believed that America was weak, divided, and technically inferior. That was the conviction fueled by 3 years of Nazi propaganda, a narrative that depicted the United States as a decadent, Jewish-controlled nation with no discipline, no honor, no future. General Alfred Jodl himself had said, months earlier, that Americans know how to build refrigerators, not armies. That confidence was about to be crushed not by bombs, but by mass production. The war these men believed they understood would be rewritten before their eyes, on assembly lines, railroads, grain silos, and cranes that operated at night. The thesis was simple, but lethal. The United States did not need to win by ideology. It was enough to show the scale of its reality. This documentary follows the psychological and ideological transformation of thousands of German prisoners of war, confronted by the silent force of American industry. The viewer will see how a doctrine based on supremacy has been eroded by the banal workings of a productive society. They came as soldiers of the Reich. They would leave as witnesses of the impossible. But before we dive into the accounts and rail routes that have redesigned ideologies, there is one statistic that defines this entire story. In July 1943, German prisoners newly arrived in the United States witnessed, in a single day, an American port handle more cargo than Hamburg could handle in 7. To men coming from the African desert, where every gallon of fuel was rationed and every spare part was improvised, the scene seemed like fiction. Electric cranes operating without pause, ships being loaded in shifts that didn't end, and civilian workers who had more comfort than many Reich officers. That was only the first wound in a doctrine that still believed that America made movies, not armies. If you value the story told with accuracy, data, and respect for the facts, consider leaving your like and subscribing. This is what allows us to continue revealing stories that dismantle myths with what scares an ideology the most: reality. When the trains crossed the Texas border on that hot June night in 1943, the German prisoners still carried in their eyes the dust of the African desert, and in their minds the certainties built up by the Reich's propaganda apparatus. Men hardened by years of war, trained to despise the enemy as weak, effeminate, and disorganized, were now faced with a scenario that did not fit the narrative they knew. The train was not a freight train, nor was it a wagon 40 and 8, the structure used by the German army to transport soldiers crammed together like animals. Instead, American Pullman cars offered padded seats, convertible beds, air conditioning, and dining cars with metal cutlery and fresh towels. When the convoy slowed down in the small town of Mexia at 10 p.m., something else awaited them. Through the window, each prisoner saw what no one expected: modest houses illuminated, shops with lit windows, signs of a technical normality that did not exist even in the great cities of the Reich. In Germany since 1940, the order was for a strict blackout. Even before the war, only 20% of farms had electricity. Now, in front of rural villages with lampposts on every corner and lamps lit at 10 p.m., the propaganda began to crumble silently. What the Reich called decadent America didn't just shine at night. It gleamed with an infrastructure that the prisoners couldn't explain. What was supposed to be the beginning of a dark exile turned out to be a visual shock. The enemy didn't seem overwhelmed. It seemed comfortable. And there was more. The entire local population came to see the arrival of the prisoners, but not with stones or fury, with silence, with respect, with astonishment. They were enemies, yes, but treated with protocol, not with anger. The American soldiers escorting them spoke German. They explained the rules. They led the group with professionalism. Instead of derision or revenge, there was only efficiency. No gesture of humiliation, no provocation. It was the opposite of what the regime had taught about the American style. The first ideological pillar was beginning to give way. The Pullman wagons symbolized more than comfort. They revealed a country where even the transport of prisoners obeyed an impersonal logic of abundance, a country that did not need to suppress its enemies to appear strong. It just worked. And this operation was, to German eyes, unacceptable. During the journey between the port of disembarkation and the prison camps in the interior of Texas, many kept secret diaries, risking severe punishment if they were discovered. In one, Headman Friedrich Radke, a veteran of the French campaign and recipient of the Iron Cross First Class, wrote, "There is more light on this rural Texas road than in the entire district of Hamburg where I was born." And it was not an exaggeration. American rural electrification, driven by the Tennessee Valley Authority program and the New Deal, had already reached 90% of Texas's agricultural zones by 1943. In Germany, the statistic remained below 30%. This is the moment when arrogance turns into silence. For those who grew up hearing that Germany was the technical vanguard of the world, the vision of an enlightened, mechanized, and organized America in its most remote regions was a moral affront. And this affront came without words. No tanks, no shots, only with poles, railroads, engines, and hot meals served on time. That was the real battlefield, the place where myths would be buried under the weight of facts. And here, a pause. In 1943, the United States produced 75% of all the electricity generated on the planet. Germany, in that same year, operated with severe rationing and restricted consumption, even in urban areas. American energy superiority was not just technical, it was structural, it was cultural, it was invisible, until it became incontestable. If this statistic surprised you, comment below with "Logistics wins." The presence of comfort where there should be scarcity created a new kind of psychological terror, not the fear of dying, but the dread of having believed in something that now crumbled with every mile traveled. The enemy, supposedly weak, effeminate, and decadent, turned out to be a steel cog, powered by oil, electricity, and discipline. Mexia was the beginning, but the tracks would follow, and as the trains progressed, American truth emerged not as an exception but as a standard. On the next leg of the trip, they would see what they never expected from civilians, from workers, from a supposedly divided people. An American sergeant would apologize because the air conditioning didn't work properly, and in that trivial gesture, the doctrine of purity and superiority would begin to disintegrate without a single shot being fired. In the port of Oran on the Algerian coast, the Afrika Korps was not defeated by the Allied encirclement alone. It was dismantled by the organization. In the days following the surrender, between May 13 and 20, 1943, more than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were processed with a speed that made clear an uncomfortable truth. The United States was not just winning battles, it was executing an unprecedented logistical operation with factory precision. German officers expected chaos, retaliation, revenge. They found orderly lines, clear instructions, and standardized forms translated into fluent German. Each prisoner received an identification card with a photograph, underwent medical examinations, vaccinations, and detailed records. It was a system that functioned like an assembly line, but instead of screws, it processed human beings with an efficiency none of them had ever seen, not even in the Reich's armed forces. Hans Müller, Oberrichter captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote in a letter, "I thought they were trying to impress us. Only later did I realize that it was the standard." While the Germans improvised lists on thick paper, the Americans operated with duplicates typed, filed, numbered. The information was stored with copies sent simultaneously to the camps in the United States, to the Red Cross, and to the Central Command. It took an average of 3 minutes for a prisoner to be processed, and this happened at a rate of almost 10,000 per day. No screaming, no blows, just efficiency. For the army that prided itself on its Prussian discipline, this was devastating, because it showed something worse than physical defeat: systemic inferiority. Soldiers who had marched through Lyon, Tobruk, and Tripoli now observed American sergeants operating clipboards and stamps more accurately than German generals in the field. The American machine did not need to shout United Order or parade in Nuremberg. She spoke with results, the language of logistics. In the shadow of the docks, GMC trucks carried thousands of prisoners with marked stopovers per minute. American guards were given specific instructions on how to maintain respect for the Geneva Convention. Military doctors, nurses, interpreters, all had been trained in advance, based on manuals that anticipated each step of the process. This was not improvisation. It was planning. It was a factory. The Reich, still clinging to the romantic image of the individual soldier, now faced a new kind of force. Impersonal, silent, unstoppable, the strength of the supply chain. In a medical tent near the wharf, the German surgeon Friedrich Bauer noted in his diary, "They act as if this war were just an industrial operation. For them, we are lots, loads, inputs into a system." The remark was not critical. It was restrained admiration. In the minds of these prisoners, the awareness began to emerge that Germany's defeat might not come from arms, but from the simple fact that the Americans knew how to move more people, faster, with less error, a system that moves without hesitation, who sues thousands without screaming, who files every detail. That was scarier than a blitzkrieg, because it wasn't about speed, it was about continuity. Soldiers who had advanced by means of tanks were now overwhelmed by clips, forms, timetables, and stamps. One of the officers in charge of the operation, Major Richard Goss, would later write, "Our greatest asset was predictability. They expected confusion. We deliver method." And in this method there was something that Germany could not replicate, a state machine that produced efficiency as if it were ammunition. At the height of capture, while prisoners awaited transport in makeshift camps, the Americans were already communicating their identities to future U.S. facilities, reserving space on ships, and planning regional distribution according to each state's agricultural and industrial availability. It was the war being won in spreadsheets. No Reich doctrine had prepared these men for this kind of force, because it was a force that was not seen, only suffered, a force of procedures, applied logistics with civil discipline. And this force had not even crossed the Atlantic yet. What the prisoners did not know is that they were about to embark for the heart of a nation that multiplied ships like someone who baked bread, where a shipyard was able to build a 10,000-ton freighter in less than a week. That was the next stop, on board vessels that should not exist on that scale, toward a continent whose infrastructure would challenge everything they had learned about power. And their ideological collapse would gain traction, because the crossing would be just the beginning. The crossing of the Atlantic for the prisoners of the Africa Corps was not just a journey, it was a quiet revelation. Aboard the gigantic Liberty ships, men trained to endure German shortages witnessed a kind of abundance that seemed indecent. The decks were stocked with supply boxes that included fresh fruit, powdered milk, dehydrated eggs, canned meats, and freshly baked breads. American soldiers discarded entire portions of meals because they were cold. German prisoners watched in silence as beefsteaks were pushed into garbage cans, not by sabotage, by excess. Milk was spilled on the ground unimportant. One of them noted, "Today I saw more meat thrown away than my entire unit consumed in Stalingrad." And the worst was yet to come. They discovered that this ship, with a capacity of more than 10,000 tons of cargo, industrial kitchen, infirmary, electric generator and workshops, had been built in 4 days. 4. The shipyard in Richmond, California, broke weekly records, launching a new vessel every 96 hours. Production was so accelerated that the harbor cranes were active at night. The Liberty ships were not refined, they were not pretty, but they were enough. They were numbers, and they came by the thousands. In 1943, the United States launched 2,610 Liberty ships, nearly 1 for every 3 working hours of naval work in the country. Germany, with all its maritime tradition, managed to produce only 238 U-boat submarines that same year, and they sank faster than they could be replaced. The scales didn't hang down, she collapsed. In the ship's hold, German prisoners were given 3 meals a day, running water, clean blankets, and even dental care if needed. Everything was excessive. Everything was standardized. There was no luxury, but there was redundancy, an abundance that did not need to prove anything, because it was inevitable. In the corridors, the Germans saw American sergeants checking checklists, logistical maps, relay schedules, and reports radioed to Allied convoys en route. Each ship operated as a microcosm of total organization. The Nazis had been indoctrinated to see Americans as disorganized, undisciplined, chaotic. But what they saw were ordinary soldiers operating complex systems naturally. The system was the commander, and the system worked. The greatest humiliation for many prisoners was not the capture, it was the comparison. In the Atlantic, where they expected to find tension, they found routine. The ship Liberty symbolized what the Reich feared most: the ability of a democratic society to produce, scale, and sustain the war effort without collapsing internally. And when an American engineer was asked why Liberty ships were so simple, he replied coolly, "Because we can lose hundreds and still keep winning." It was this logic that terrified. There was no preciousness, no fetish for perfect machines. There was pragmatism. There was a series. There was method. At the height of the crossing, convoys could add up to 50 ships per formation. The supporting fleet included destroyers, anti-submarine ships, and radar-coordinated communication systems. another technology in which the Americans had quietly outmaneuvered the Germans. Ship losses, once alarming at the start of the war, had plummeted. U-boats, once hunters, were now the prey. And all the while, each captured prisoner watched his comrades being transported not as human burdens, but as components of a larger machine. The holds transported food, the decks brought disassembled trucks, the shelves carried standardized parts that served both tanks and tractors. Each ship was a logistics cell, not a masterpiece, but a statistic. And the prisoners gradually realized that they were facing something that they could not combat with tactics. There was no enemy general to be defeated. There was a process. The German doctrine of centralization and precision was now confronted with a new doctrine, that of scale, repetition, and adaptability. And as they crossed the ocean, eating more calories than they did in entire weeks in North Africa, it was clear that the enemy wasn't just superior in resources, he was superior in flexibility. Aboard a Liberty ship crossing the Atlantic in July 1943, Lieutenant Heinz Becker confided to his colleague, "Perhaps we have not understood what modern warfare is. They are not great in discipline, but they don't have to be." The officer's observation ended a mental era, because he admitted that the enemy's victory did not come from rigidity, but from fluidity, and the Atlantic, once a chasm between continents, now became a conveyor belt, where men, machines, and food were transported like cogs in a machine that never stopped. On the horizon, American ports were approaching, and what awaited them on dry land was even more difficult to accept. Because abundance was no exception. It was the beginning. When the Liberty ships docked in Norfolk on the east coast of the United States, German prisoners were prepared to find soldiers, fences, and control. What they saw, however, was something that no doctrine foresaw: uninterrupted movement, scale without measure, and wealth without explanation. The naval base operated like a living city. Electric cranes moved fluidly on elevated rails, removing containers with mathematical precision. Trains came and went on punctually. Ships were everywhere, not just military. There were freighters, tugboats, oil tankers. Each terminal seemed to have been designed to work 24 hours a day, and it worked. But what impressed the men of the Africa Corps most were not the machines. It was the people. Civil workers in simple clothes drove their own cars. Dock workers, black and white, shared cafeterias and shifts naturally. There were restaurants open to the public within the military perimeter. The train cars all refrigerated, and air conditioning, hitherto unknown to most Germans, was treated as a common detail, a routine comfort, not a privilege. Prisoners began to notice the pattern. What was luxury for the Reich was banality in America. Meat, previously rationed in grams per week, was consumed as a snack. Cars, previously exclusive to officers, now driven by clerks and students. Electricity, once rationed in German cities, now even powered billboards at a naval base. A Wehrmacht corporal, observing the activity from the port, said, "If this is their rear, our effort has no chance." It was a harsher trial than any sentence, and it was based on facts. The Norfolk base moved an average of 140 ships per month in 1943. Hamburg, Germany's largest port, reached 30 under bombardment, and even before the war it had never reached American fluidity. Norfolk was no exception. It was standard, one of dozens of ports on the American coast, each of them with mechanized docks, integrated rail services, automated inventory systems, and trained civilian workforce. The shock was systemic. The Reich had based its strategy on the idea that the United States was too slow, too divided, too complex. But what the prisoners saw was not complexity. It was a 1,000-armed machine, operating without a center, without fanfare, without a cult of personality. The American force was in the absence of spectacle. Everything was excessive, but never vain. The refrigerated wagons kept fresh food for troops thousands of miles away. The grains were unloaded with machines that resembled mobile silos. The bureaucracy was digital for time. Each shipment was recorded on cards that were transmitted by telegraph, stamped and processed with no margin for error. This efficiency did not need to be explained. It was visible. She suffocated for order. And the irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. It was not the generals who won the war. They were the crane operators. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts and understanding how logistics has redefined the battlefield, like and subscribe. This helps us to continue revealing stories that propaganda has tried to hide. For the prisoners, the day in Norfolk was more than a landing. It was the first real doubt. The first crack, the first question that could not find an answer in Goebbels, nor in Hitler, nor in the party newspapers. Because if even the simplest worker lived better than many Luftwaffe officers, what else had they lied about? This doubt would become corrosive in the following days. And the next train they would take, the one that would take them into the deep interior of America, would only widen that gap between what they believed and what they saw. Because on the tracks, in the countryside, in the night of small towns, the ideological collapse would begin, and he would come with light. Traversing the interior of the United States in 1943 wasn't just a trip, it was a sensory assault on Nazi doctrine. When the trains left East Coast ports for the interior of Texas, German prisoners expected to find the rural and decadent America that Reich propaganda described with disdain. Instead, they saw a country that was illuminated, mechanized, supplied, and functional even in the smallest cities. The windows of the carriages became inverted mirrors. They showed a reality that not only contradicted, but demolished the mental pillars of National Socialism. The propaganda claimed that the United States was racial chaos, a jumble of Jews, blacks, and decadent capitalists. But the tracks showed another scenario: well-maintained stations, heated houses, electric power grids in villages with fewer than 1,000 inhabitants, factories operating overnight, and paved roads connecting even the most remote points. The impact was not on luxury, but on normality. Private Dieter Groll, a former member of the 15th Panzer Division, recorded in a clandestine diary, "How can these people live like this without a single leadership? Where is the misery that we were promised to see?" The phrase, "every American city has had electricity since the 1920s," circulated among the prisoners as an offense. Not because it is false, but because it is true. In Germany, more than half of rural areas still relied on candles, wood stoves, and lanterns. In the United States, concrete poles and electrical transformers crossed crops, rivers, and deserts as naturally as railroads. In every city, even the most isolated, prisoners saw lit signs, traffic lights operating, restaurants open late. There was no electricity rationing, not even queues, nor fear. One of the most emblematic moments occurred upon arrival at a village in Arkansas, where the train stopped briefly for fueling. A group of peasant women waited on the platform, smiling, well-dressed, accompanied by children with ice cream in hand. Ahead, a mail truck passed by with headlights on. In the background, a hardware store remained open, illuminated, even though it was already night. No prisoner spoke, but everyone looked. The doctrine of German civilizational superiority now seemed like a poorly mounted farce. The Reich, with all its pomp, could not guarantee a peasant half of what those American women possessed without uniform, without salute, without anthem. That was the moment when the doctrine began to break down from within, not with arguments, with images. The rails cut through states, but they also cut certainties. American infrastructure was too visible to be denied, and that was what hurt. The truth was in front of them, on poles, on wires, on windows lit at 11 p.m. It was there that the deepest defeat began, the ideological one. Because while the Reich buckled under scarcity, America seemed to know no concept. Prisoners who had spent weeks eating dry rations saw stations with cafeterias offering eggs, bacon, and fresh milk. Milk, especially, has become an involuntary symbol of humiliation. In Germany, it was reserved for the wounded or children. In the United States, it came in glass bottles, delivered by trucks every day, even in the most remote villages. A Luftwaffe officer, upon seeing this system working in the Kansas countryside, remarked, "They live as if war didn't exist." And indeed, in much of America, war was an abstraction. The factories worked in 3 shifts, but supermarkets were still stocked. The shelves were not empty. The radio broadcast songs, not bulletins of despair. The civilian population did not hide. She drove. She produced. She voted. The system worked without terror. This was what made the moral collapse advance, because for the Nazi machine, control was synonymous with strength, and there was the enemy. No whips, no surveillance cameras, and with 1,000 times the results. This organized freedom was the greatest threat that the Reich could not foresee, and the tracks followed. At each stop, one more city, one more race, a field of mechanized wheat, a group of students with backpacks and bicycles, a hospital operating at night, a radio station running on top of a building. Direct vision became the final argument. The doctrine was reduced to noise before what the eyes saw. Prisoner Hans Werfel, writing in 1946, would recall, "I did not abandon National Socialism in a cell. I abandoned it when I saw a factory operating at midnight in the middle of Arkansas. That was the effect of the tracks. They didn't just take men, they took consciences." And every mile traveled was an inch short of faith in the regime that sent them. But fate still reserved a bigger shock, because if the rails revealed the workings of America, what awaited behind the fences of the prison camps was even more unforgivable to the Nazi spirit. Respect. And there the ideological collapse would gain a face, a voice, and routine. When the first prisoners began working under surveillance in American industrial zones, many still carried with them a deep-seated idea. The Germans were the masters of technique, the inventors of precision engineering, the guardians of scientific excellence. But that conviction began to melt, like rubber under pressure, when they saw America's productive heartland in action. At Willow Run, Michigan, the Ford compound operated day and night with a cadence that defied any known military logic. It was an assembly line of B-24 Liberator bombers, but not just any line. It was a 2-kilometer-long corridor where aluminum entered at one end, and 63 minutes later, an 18-ton bomber flew out the other. A complete airplane, engine, cockpit, armament, radio, paint, and fuel, finished every 63 minutes. Not even the Luftwaffe engineers believed it at first glance. In Germany, an aircraft of this size took, on average, 30 working days to be assembled. Here, scale replaced refinement, speed replaced technical reverence, and the final product, far from being rudimentary, worked, bombed, came back, and was replaced by another before the enemy could react. But if Willow Run was the aerial metaphor of American superiority, Rubbertown, Kentucky, was the point where the technical humiliation took on a chemical tone. Prisoners with an industrial background, especially those linked to IG, Farben, were allowed to work under surveillance, on auxiliary or observation duties, in synthetic rubber factories. And it was there that they discovered the unthinkable. The Americans had mastered, scaled up, and surpassed the chemical process of producing artificial rubber, a process that the Germans themselves had invented. By 1940, Germany controlled more than 90% of Europe's natural rubber. With colonial routes blocked, the United States launched the largest chemical substitution program in history. In less than 3 years, U.S. synthetic rubber production jumped from 0 to 800,000 tons a year, 7 times more than the total capacity of the Reich. The Rubbertown plants operated with refineries connected by underground pipelines, continuous reactors, and automated purification systems. What Germany did in small batches, the Americans did in continuous flow reactors. Chemist Otto Rasfeld, captured in Tunisia, wrote after observing part of the process, "They outdid us using the process we invented. The difference? They scale. We revere." This phrase would become a symbol of a cultural blind spot. While Germany idolized the genius engineer, the visionary technician, the American relied on mass production, and by trusting, he won. Nazi technical pride, which saw industry as an extension of the Aryan genius, now faced a culture that made industry a public good, replicable, functional. Willow Run produced airplanes as if they were tractors. Rubbertown generated rubber as if it were wheat. Everything in America seemed to obey the logic of excess, and this excess was disciplined. There was no waste of method, only of matter. The Reich, which considered itself the pinnacle of technical civilization, now saw its inventions being improved, accelerated, and distributed like pieces of a giant puzzle in which everything fell into place. In the prison camps, rumors became data. The data turned into despair, because they were not rumors. They were statistics confirmed by eyes, ears, and stopwatches. It was not a myth. It was timed, visible, auditable production. 1 B-24 per hour. 1 ton of synthetic rubber every 15 minutes. And the prisoners knew. The Reich could not answer that, he could resist. But I couldn't climb, because his doctrine did not accept standardization, and his industry did not support improvisation. The result was inevitable. Private Heinrich Kugler, a former employee of the Messerschmitt plant in Augsburg, remarked to an American guard, "The problem is not that you build better, it's just that you build faster, much more." It was a conceptual surrender, because for the first time, those men trained to believe in their technical superiority saw clearly that the war would not be won by detail, but by scale. And this scale could not be fought with belief. It was numerical. It was continuous. She was self-sufficient. But there was still one last piece to this logistical puzzle that they didn't know about. An invisible but vital element that sustained every plane at Willow Run, every ton of rubber at Rubbertown, every meal on a train or prison camp. Energy. And that energy, they would soon discover, didn't just come from oil or coal. It came from something that Germany had never been able to create on a large scale. A national electricity grid, an invisible network of power that crossed continents. And when they saw this network, there would be no turning back. In the agricultural fields of the Texas countryside, the convictions of German POWs began to shatter, not under shouting or threats, but under the deafening silence of waste. Under the open sky, surrounded by endless crops of wheat, corn, and cotton, those men who had crossed deserts and survived the logistical aridity of North Africa were faced with a scene that no Reich indoctrination manual had prepared for: perfect food being thrown away. In dumpsters, trucks, and even in open pits, tons of fruits, vegetables, and milk were discarded, not because they were spoiled, but because of excess. The reasoning was simple: keep the price stable. The abundance was such that part of the production had to be destroyed so as not to break the market. To men who saw hungry children rummaging through cans in Berlin, it seemed insanity. And yet, here it was, the most brutal demonstration that they were facing something other than militarism. It was a civilization operating so efficiently that waste was part of the strategy. One prisoner, the son of a baker in Leipzig, wrote in his hidden notebook, "Today, I saw more bread in the garbage than my entire street consumed in a month." The impact was psychological but also moral. This was not just a difference in system, it was an affront to the idea of national sacrifice. Germany demanded deprivation as proof of patriotism. America imposed abundance as a symbol of normality. In the fields, agricultural machinery harvested grain in perfect rows. In a single day, a single McCormick harvester produced the equivalent of a week's worth of manual labor. The grains, stored in metal silos dozens of meters high, were monitored by temperature and humidity sensors, and if there was a risk of surplus, part was sold, part was burned, part buried. The efficiency was such that the system preferred to lose products rather than lose control. At this point, it is worth highlighting a little-known statistic, but devastating to German perception. In 1943, the United States produced more than 120 million tons of food, almost 3 times more than all of occupied Europe, even under Nazi control. If this difference impresses you, comment now, absolute power, because that was the feeling that was imposing itself before their eyes. Absolute power, but not authoritarian, managed by committees, regulated by the market, sustained by logistics. The irony was suffocating. The Germans, who had made scarcity a national virtue, now saw ordinary civilians throwing away what Wehrmacht officials considered feasting. A group of prisoners working under supervision at a cotton field in Mississippi watched in disbelief as trucks carried fruit directly for disposal. One of them asked the guard, "Is this punishment?" The American replied, confused, "No, this is excess." The phrase reverberated, because she summed it all up. The Reich based its moralism on the idea that the world was hostile and limited, that only the disciplined would survive. But there, in the heart of the United States, nature and industry conspired to produce more than could be consumed. The system wasn't perfect, but it was self-sufficient. And this self-sufficiency, regulated by thermostats, gears, and spreadsheets, was worth 1,000 speeches. Captain Franz Neumann, a graduate in agricultural engineering, confided to his cellmate weeks later, "Their greatest strength is that they don't fight against scarcity, they eliminate it." And what did this mean in military terms? It meant that while the Reich relied on territorial conquests to feed its soldiers, the United States could send fresh rations to the Pacific Islands without having to raid an inch. The war of supplies was not war, it was supply, and supply was what kept armies alive. The Nazi doctrine, with its obsession with conquering living space, now seemed anachronistic in the face of a system that created living space through tractors, fertilizers, and railroad lines. For the prisoners, this realization was unbearable, because it wasn't just a defeat, it was an invalidation. The direct view of abundance has become the most lethal weapon against ideology. Nothing they saw in the pamphlets, in the doctrine classes, in the speeches of Goebbels, resisted the sight of a crop being harvested at night with tractor headlights, and part of the harvest being buried by excess. It was a war won not with rifles, but with silos, and the most bitter was yet to come. Because if America had shown power, organization, and abundance so far, the next impact would be more profound. Because they would get to know the invisible weapon, the network that connected all sectors, electricity. And when they saw that even a gas station in an isolated village was running on power 24 hours a day, there was no longer any denying it. The enemy they mocked didn't just win, he was decades ahead. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the war seemed to be over, not because the walls were low or because surveillance was lax, but because inside, the logic of war had been inverted. The German prisoners, many still proud of their decorations and doctrine, were greeted with something they did not expect: respect. Unlike Soviet camps, where starvation and forced labor were weapons, or even German camps themselves, where prisoners were dehumanized, Americans treated their captives with a code that seemed to contradict the logic of the conflict. At Camp Hearn, each prisoner received 3 meals a day, which was higher in calories than the soldiers at the front. Meat was frequent, the bread fresh, the water drinkable and abundant. Clothes were washed in organized shifts. Each tent had clean mattresses and numbered blankets. But what caused the most astonishment was not on the plate, nor on the bed. It was in the pharmacy. For the first time, many prisoners had access to penicillin, an antibiotic in short supply in Europe, reserved for a few. At Camp Hearn, it was distributed as a basic duty. Minor injuries were treated with sterile gauze. Ear infections received immediate attention. Emergency surgeries were conducted by military doctors with the support of trained civilian nurses. A captured German doctor, an expert in abdominal trauma, wrote, "The techniques I have seen here are at least 5 years more advanced than those in Prussia." And he didn't just see it, he was invited to learn. American medical officers administered sessions to prisoners who had health training. In small auditoriums, diagrams, anatomical samples, and procedures were explained in English, French, and German. Education there was not propaganda, it was access. The prisoners were given newspapers, both American and German language bulletins supervised by neutral bodies. In the halls once a week there were film projections, not just documentaries, Hollywood movies, dramas, musicals, comedies. The most skeptical called it manipulation. But as the months passed, the effect was different. Reflection. For the first time, those men trained to kill who had sworn allegiance to a totalitarian regime had time to think, time to observe, time to compare. Nazi doctrine had taught that the enemy was barbaric, disorganized, weak. But the enemy now served hot soup. It cured infections. He exhibited Shakespeare in the cafeteria, and he respected, to a certain extent, his humanity. Re-education did not come in pamphlets. It came in the logic of details. Prisoner Friedrich Müller wrote, "I was not converted by speeches. They converted me with silence." Because what spoke louder were not arguments. They were systems that worked. A prison camp with a library, sports court, dental care, and an infirmary equipped with x-rays. A field where the letters arrived, where the food tasted, where the clock worked, where there was room to walk. Where an American general could shake hands with a German corporal and ask, "How's your ankle?" The doctrine of hatred could not resist this kind of gesture. An initially arrogant Waffen-SS officer refused to accept any contact with the Americans. He called the guards subhuman Democrats. 3 months later, he was seen exchanging recipes with a Texan cook, because fanaticism demands hunger. It requires fear. It requires isolation. And Camp Hearn offered the opposite. It was as if every structure in the camp, every functional plumbing, every clean dish, every doctor's appointment was a lesson in moral engineering. And the greatest irony was this: what the Reich tried to impose by force, America routinely dismantled. The prisoners were not forced to change their minds. They were invited to see the world working in a different way, and many accepted, slowly, silently, inevitably. And it is at this moment that the war ceased to be military and became cultural, because it was no longer about tanks, but about convictions. It was no longer a question of weaponry, but of worldview. And for many of those prisoners, this confrontation was more difficult than El Alamein, because it was not enough to survive. It was necessary to admit that they had been deceived. But the final blow was yet to come, because if Camp Hearn looked modern, there was something even more disturbing waiting in the next town, a factory that did not produce bombs, but brains. And there, the confrontation between science and ideology would reach its peak. In the weeks following their Camp Herne housing, hundreds of German prisoners were assigned to supervised jobs on farms, sawmills, and industrial civilian sectors, not as punishment but as a support force. It was a common practice in the United States. With millions of men at the front, the rear had to keep the country running. And it was precisely in this context that the prisoners began to witness what was perhaps the quietest and most structural shake-up of their worldview. What they saw were not soldiers, nor generals. They were women, thousands of them, young, old, mothers, students. Instead of aprons, industrial overalls. Instead of needles, cranes, operating tractors, forklifts, hydraulic presses, and assembly belts. In Kansas camps, prisoners saw harvesters driven by 19-year-old girls. In Arkansas factories, they saw girls with their hair tied up by red scarves welding parts with surgical precision. That, to the Nazi mind, was impossible. The Reich doctrine had institutionalized the idea of women as domestic helpers and breeders of the race. In America, she was an engineer, a driver, a mechanic, and more, she was respected. On a railroad maintenance shift, one prisoner remarked aloud that the Americans had turned the country over to women. The American supervisor replied calmly, "And look how it's working." The comment was met with silence. But it was just the beginning, because alongside these women, other workers operated that the Reich classified as inferior: blacks, Mexicans, descendants of Asians, and not in menial, but technical functions. Black men operating electrical panels, Hispanics driving hydraulic systems, Asians supervising quality control labs. In many places, whites and non-whites ate in the same dining hall. They worked at the same pace. They received the same training. That didn't make sense for an ideology based on racial hierarchy, but it was undeniable. And it worked. It was this diversity, invisible in advertisements, but alive in production, that sustained the American machine. One prisoner, observing a mixed group building bridges in record time, remarked, "They use them all, and that's what makes them invincible." The phrase was not a compliment. It was a fact. America's strength was not just in the factories. It was in the ability to mobilize the whole of society, not out of fear, but out of conviction, not by imposition, but by adherence. And when the prisoners realized that most of the country's male youth were fighting thousands of miles away, and yet production hadn't slowed down, something broke. The logic of military force as the only metric of power was no longer sustainable, because here was a society that functioned without its soldiers, that produced with women, with immigrants, with teenagers, with people that the Reich would never let into a factory, and yet it produced more, faster, more precisely, more result. In numbers, this translated brutally. In 1944, the United States produced 1 plane per hour, 7,000 tanks per month, and 400 ships per year, even with 16 million citizens enlisted in the war effort. If this scale surprises you, imagine the effect in the eyes of those who believed that the world was divided between superiors and submissives. Prisoner Karl Drexler, a former Gestapo officer, would confess years later, America was an armed democracy, and that's what made it invincible. Because it was not enough to have machines, it was necessary to have hands, and America had them all. Women, blacks, workers, young people, all trained, all paid, all respected within the logic of production. There was no room for idleness, nor room for doctrines of exclusion. Efficiency came from inclusion. The order came from the flow. What the Reich called degeneration was, in practice, adaptation, and this adaptation was the real strength. On the pitches, the conversations have changed. The arrogance disappeared, the doubt took shape. If the enemy they mocked was able to operate the entire country, even with the youth absent, what else had they underestimated? The answer would come at the next stop, because if until now the prisoners had seen production, organization, and dignity, the next impact would not be material. It would be invisible but total. They would discover the network that connected all of this, the American electrical infrastructure. And there, in the technical detail that went unnoticed by the hurried eye, they would find the element that made everything work. In Canton, Ohio, the tracks vibrated with a constant frequency that did not cease at dusk. It was the sound of a living plant, not in the metaphorical sense, but in the physical, the technical, the industrial. Republic Steel operated as an iron and steam organism, a monumental architecture of boilers, crawlers, cranes, and cast steel aisles. It was there that a group of German prisoners, escorted for logistical work, faced the greatest cognitive dissonance of the entire war. At first glance, the complex looked like an entire city under a roof of smoke. But as they entered, they realized the unthinkable. A single American steel complex produced more steel in a single day than the entire Ruhr region at its peak. For men who had been trained to see the Ruhr as the backbone of European industry, this realization was more than a surprise. It was an ideological defeat. On one of the inner docks, where inner tracks carried wagons with pre-processed ore, a former Krupp employee watched in silence. An American engineer noticed his expression and casually remarked, "Today we are going to melt 14,000 tons. Tomorrow, the 16th. The German did not answer. He made a mental calculation. And then he muttered to his colleague next to him, "In my factory, their scum would be enough to keep our furnaces burning for a whole week." It was true. American waste, by their standards, exceeded the total production capacity of most German factories. But this waste was actually part of the cost of the excess, because the American system did not depend on every screw. It depended on flow. At Republic Steel, the ore arrived by sensor-controlled wagons. The ovens did not turn off. The shifts alternated like human cogs. The steel left in plates, rails, tubes, and plates, destined for factories that transformed everything into ships, planes, weapons, tractors, and engines. The factory did not stop, not because it was forced, but because it was designed not to stop. And this confused the prisoners. To the indoctrinated mind of the German worker, individual effort was almost sacred. Propaganda extolled sweat, the genius engineer, the heroic worker. In America, the system replaced the hero, and it worked better. What the prisoners saw was the replacement of genius with predictability. Talent was less important than schedule. The pride was in the result, not in the method. And this impersonal, almost cold logic was the key to American superiority. In numbers, she was unquestionable. In 1943, the United States produced 89 million tons of crude steel, 3 times more than Nazi Germany and its occupied territories combined. And this steel supplied all sectors: construction, energy, transportation, defense, agriculture. The prisoners saw trains carrying beams that looked like they were made for skyscrapers, trucks carrying coils that would serve as hulls for ships, molded plates for Sherman tanks, mobile bridges, armor. It wasn't just volume, it was destiny. Steel didn't stop at the factory, it turned into power, and this conversion was daily. A former German worker from Essen, upon seeing the continuous rolling line, said to the guard, "If our line stopped for 5 minutes, we had punishment. Here it doesn't stop, and no one screams." Because there, the secret was not the pressure, it was the scale, constancy, the system. And when they realized this, many prisoners finally understood the original error of the Nazi doctrine, believing that strength came from race, will, myth, when in fact it came from the ability to keep the boilers burning 7 days a week. Republic Steel was a modern temple, not of worship, but of operation, and what the prisoners felt there was not personal humiliation, it was historical irrelevance, because they realized that they were not the center of anything, that their beliefs, sacrifices, and symbols were fragile in front of a well-calibrated treadmill. And this shock, more than any defeat on the battlefield, was definitive. But the revelation was not yet over, because as they left the plant, the prisoners observed something that would amplify this feeling even more. The railroad did not stop at the gate. It connected the factory to an invisible national network, and this mesh was the next step of the lesson. They would discover that true American power wasn't just in the furnaces, it was on the tracks, and that in that country, distance was a variable surpassed by engineering. In 1944, Camp Huntsville, Texas, was no longer just a prison camp. It became, slowly and silently, a school. Not a school in the classical sense, with blackboards, tests, or rewards, but an environment where thought began to replace obedience. The structure was simple: a makeshift reading room, daily newspapers, civilian university volunteers, and a schedule that included everything from American history to fundamentals of Western philosophy. The most surprising thing was not the existence of the program, it was the adherence. Spontaneously, dozens, then hundreds of prisoners began attending English classes, debates on the Constitution, and even cycles of reading Aristotle and Kant. The content was translated when necessary and adapted, but not softened. American democracy was not presented as propaganda, it was presented as a problem, as an idea to be discussed, questioned, confronted, and precisely for this reason, it has become irresistible. Because after the moral collapse of Nazi doctrine, many of these men sought more than security. They were looking for meaning. And in this vacuum left by the bankrupt ideology, the American model imposed itself not as absolute truth, but as a living possibility. A former Luftwaffe officer wrote, "I spent 10 years learning that freedom was chaos. Here, I discovered that freedom is a shared responsibility." This perception did not arise from pamphlets. It arose from practice. The prisoners organized internal commissions to decide rules of coexistence. They voted for representatives. They debated real problems: distribution of tasks, reading times, organization of cultural events. For the first time, they exercised what they had been trained to fear: autonomy. And this autonomy was transformative. Because the American system did not seek to impose faith in its values. It sought to demonstrate its functionality, and it was functional. Courses offered ranged from agricultural management to civil engineering fundamentals. One prisoner with a technical background even collaborated with the local municipality on irrigation projects. Another, a translator by training, became an assistant teacher of English for his colleagues. And even more telling, the American guards not only allowed it, they encouraged it. Seeing a group discussing Montesquieu, a Texan soldier remarked, "We don't need you to change. You just need them to see how different it is." And they did. In 1944, more than 2,000 prisoners in American camps participated in educational activities. In contrast, no German camp offered any form of intellectual debate to the captives. The shock was so great that the International Red Cross itself recorded in a report, "The educational system within American camps may in some cases surpass that of civilian schools in countries at war." If this contrast impresses you, comment now. Shocking data. Because for those men, many educated loyal to the Nazi doctrine, the shock was not only in the machines or in the tanks, it was in the books, to be able to discuss, to be able to make mistakes, to be able to doubt without fear of punishment. And when you can doubt, you can rebuild. The intellectual transformation was so profound that at the end of the war, several prisoners requested to remain in the US as refugees. Some were repatriated and became teachers, lawyers, journalists, men who had once advocated a regime of absolute control and now promoted ideas they had learned behind fences. This was democracy's invisible weapon, the ability to offer freedom not as a gift, but as a challenge. And many accepted the challenge, because the model they found in the fields was not perfect, but it was authentic. And for those who spent years under a regime of well-packaged lies, authenticity was liberating. But the most symbolic lesson was yet to come. Because outside the gates, in addition to the books and debates, there was a city that worked 24 hours a day, a city connected by an invisible thread that no prisoner had fully understood: electricity. And upon discovering how America had electrified its wholeness decades in advance, the prisoners would understand that the real power was not in the words, but in the system that sustained them. On the night of December 24, 1943, in various prison camps across the United States, something happened that no Nazi doctrine could foresee, let alone neutralize. The cold cut through the interior of Texas, Arkansas, Georgia. But inside the sheds, there was heat. Not only that of improvised greenhouses, but that of a human gesture impossible to be interpreted by indoctrinated eyes. Prisoners of war, men who months earlier had marched under swastikas, were given packages, not the military, of civilians. Letters, boxes, candy, gloves, handwritten cards. Some were signed with only a first name: Mary, Joe, Helen. Others brought children's drawings. "Merry Christmas, prisoner. May God keep you and your mother be well." In one of the camps, American scouts entered the gates with baskets of dried fruit and chocolates. In another, a choir from the local Lutheran community, singing in German, sang "Stille Nacht" in front of prisoners in silence. Soldiers who had served in Europe and who had lost friends to the same men who were now there, sat next to them to share coffee, bread, and memories. The impact was devastating, not on the body, but on the soul, because no weapon is more destabilizing than the kindness of the enemy. What those prisoners experienced that night was not a truce, it was a moral breakdown. Nazi racial ideology was based on systematic dehumanization. The American was described as a degenerate half-breed, a product of mixture of liberal chaos of moral corruption. But that night, the one who practiced compassion was the inferior. The one who offered forgiveness was the one who was bombed. The one who reached out was the one who had lost a brother in Normandy. One of the prisoners, a former member of the Hitler Youth, wrote in his diary, "We were taught to hate, and they treated us like men." Another, an older Wehrmacht sergeant, reported that he cried for the first time since the beginning of the war, not because of pain, out of shame. In a makeshift chapel cell, a Methodist pastor offered a short homily, translated word for word by an American official. "Today we celebrate the birth of a man who taught that every enemy is a brother in disguise." Some prisoners laughed, others looked away, but almost all of them stayed, and they listened. The dinner was not luxurious, but it was clean, plentiful and quietly fraternal. Candles were lit, a cake was shared between sheds, and at the end of the night, when the count of prisoners was accurately recounted, a guard commented, "No one tried to escape. They were not surrounded by fences. They were surrounded by doubts." Because Christmas Eve did not hurt military pride. It hurt racial pride. The idea of superiority, which underpinned the whole logic of the Reich, did not resist generosity. How to explain to yourself that the enemy sings your songs, respects your dead, welcomes your children, and yet is considered inferior? Nazi doctrine was made to face bayonets, not gifts from children, not kind words, not tuned voices that, in the German language, celebrated peace. And that is why that night marked so many prisoners irreversibly, because there was no Goebbels order, no military statistics, no tactical victory that explained what they were experiencing. A German major after Christmas refused lunch from the camp for the first time. When questioned, he replied, "I need to digest something else first." It was not irony, it was true, because he knew, as many in that camp did, that the internal war had begun, not between armies, but between versions of humanity. And the version that scared me the most wasn't the violent one, it was the compassionate one, because it gently dismantled the entire ideological construct that had led millions to destruction. But the final blow would not come in the form of music, it would come in the form of a grid, because in the next phase, the prisoners would discover that labor camps in the US had productivity rates equal to, or higher than, those of civilian industry. And this meant that the weak enemy had created not only abundance, but discipline without repression. And that, yes, was a threat that not even Hitler could understand. In the summer of 1944, the hot winds blowing over Kansas and Nebraska didn't just bring dust or heat, they bring revelations. For hundreds of German POWs, reassigned as auxiliary labor in the harvests of the American Midwest, work in the field became the scene of yet another ideological collapse, but this time not in front of steel or war machines, but in front of wheat. The battlefield was now farming. And there Germany didn't just lose, it was annulled. Sons of farmers from Bavaria, the Rhineland or Silesia, men raised among hoes and furrows of earth, watched harvesters that looked like moving ships, equipment so large that it needed stairs for access. Each of them, controlled by a single operator, harvested more in an hour than 100 workers could harvest in a day. The noise was hypnotic. The rhythm is constant. The grain was sucked, separated, packaged, and deposited without human hands touching a single ear. In parallel, giant tractors with tires larger than a man crossed the fields, connected to multiple implements, plowing, fertilizing, and sowing simultaneously. One prisoner quietly remarked, "This is not agriculture, it's engineering abundance." Their astonishment intensified when they realized that the farmers had radios at home, refrigerators, cars. One of them casually mentioned having 2 sons in the war and a daughter studying engineering. One prisoner, surprised, asked, "Is your daughter going to become an engineer?" The answer came naturally. Of course, why not? But the final blow was in the discard. Piles of corn, wheat, potatoes, perfect food being buried or burned, not because of a shortage of consumption, but because of overproduction. To keep prices stable, the US government bought the surplus and in many cases eliminated it. A son of a Saxon peasant, upon witnessing the waste, burst into tears. For 3 years, his family had survived on sawdust loaves and turnip soup. There, what for him was hope, for the American system was statistics. An abundance that not only fed but regulated. An agricultural reserve official explained, "Our problem is not to produce, it is to balance the supply." no sentence had hurt so much, because it made it clear that Americans were not struggling to survive, they were struggling to organize plenty. In 1944, the US produced 1.2 billion bushels of wheat. Germany, under blockade, barely reached 250 million, and that's with a significant portion of American youth still serving overseas. If this scale is impressive, comment, logistics wins. Because it was precisely this invisible structure, made of tractors, grains, and public policies, that dismantled the myth of German self-sufficiency. Germany preached the Blut und Boden, blood and soil. America responded with tractor and engine. A victory without a parade, a defeat without bombing. The prisoners became automatic silos, railway lines connecting the farm to the city, financing programs that allowed any average farmer to operate as a business. And more impressive, everything with room for waste. What the Reich treated as a symbol of scarcity, the American discarded by economic calculation. The prisoners' pain didn't just come from the comparison, it came from the discovery that they had never competed on an equal footing. Nazi propaganda painted the United States as decadent, soulless, weak-minded. But there, in the dry heat of the Midwest, the 12-ton tractor was operated by a 19-year-old woman with leather gloves, a wrench around her waist, and a scarf in her hair. She didn't talk about ideals. He talked about torque, planting time and soil rotation. And this was the real revolution, the force that did not need to assert itself, that he didn't shout slogans, that he just did, and he did better. But the next shock would come in closed wagons, not in open fields. Because the trains that crossed the plains, that carried grain to the north and steel to the south, were the epitome of what the prisoners had not yet fully understood. A nation that not only produced, but connected with speed and precision that the Reich could never achieve. And this network, invisible, immense, and infallible, would be the protagonist of the next revelation. At a certain point, it was no longer known whether the prisoners' eyes stared at the labor camps or the details of the American organization. What had begun as a silent astonishment, a succession of industrial and logistical shocks, now turned into something more dangerous and more definitive. Admiration. Not that admiration disguised as technical analysis, but genuine respect. Conversations once marked by patriotic laments, nostalgia for the Reich, and hopes of return, now revolved around agricultural methods, transportation efficiency, public administration. America, once despised as soulless chaos, came to be seen as a model, and for some as a chance. A sergeant in the German 10th Army, a former factory worker in Bremen, said during a dinner in the camp, "What they built here in 50 years, we couldn't achieve in 500. Another, an engineer, began to write down the operation of a hydraulic system he observed in a Texas mill. He commented, "Such a solution would be useful on the Danube." The irony of this story is that the answer to the German crisis has always been before them, but she was invisible under the lens of arrogance. If you're enjoying unraveling these hidden facts and silent transformations, like and subscribe. That's what allows us to bring more content like this. Real stories, where victory is not only made of battles, but of ideas. The emotional turnaround on the pitch was evident. Guards and prisoners exchanged tools, recipes, books. One of them, educated in Munich, asked for a copy of the American Constitution, not to translate but to understand. Another asked if, after the war, he could study engineering in the United States. Many no longer spoke like temporarily defeated soldiers. They spoke like men who knew that the old world would not return, and perhaps should not. The Nazi doctrine, which had shaped them since childhood, now seemed like a belt that was too tight. It suffocated, limited, isolated. American freedom, by contrast, was not presented as glory, but as responsibility, as a risk, and that made it more real. The prisoners realized that American strength was not just their productive scale, it was his ability to include, adapt, improve. The farmer who repaired his own tractor, the teacher who managed a school shed as a company, the 14-year-old girl who operated a forklift with the same confidence as an artillery sergeant. The future was there, and it was functional. The American system did not need oaths, nor symbols, nor marches. It worked because it trusted that the common citizen could learn. And this was the greatest heresy against the Reich, to believe that the people could be more than a mass. The conversion was silent but profound. It was no longer uncommon to see prisoners proposing improvements in the camps, organizing inventories, drawing agricultural maps based on American techniques. And even more symbolic, the Americans let it, because they understood that winning was not humiliating, it was to transform. A U.S. Army lieutenant in charge of a camp in Arkansas wrote in a report, "They arrived as enemies, they will leave as neighbors." And indeed, many left carrying books, notes, and plans for a new Germany, not based on race or power, but on efficiency and freedom. But there was still a final chapter in this process of transformation, a symbol that epitomized everything that Nazi propaganda feared, an object that united the steel of industry, the logic of mass production, and the myth of invincibility, the B-29 bomber. And when the prisoners discovered what he was capable of doing and where it had been built, all would turn to reverence, because the plane that would change the war was also the end product of what they had seen in pieces, America functioning as a system. In April 1945, as the United States prepared to end the war in Europe, a new front was opened, not on the battlefields, but in consciousness. In the American prison camps, scattered throughout the South and Midwest, a new routine was imposed. Captured German soldiers had to attend mandatory movie screenings. As they entered the adapted sheds, they expected more training documentaries, perhaps footage of the Italian surrender or the Soviet offensive. But what they saw was not strategy, it was horrible. Screen after screen, frame after frame, the American camera, objective, impassive, continuous, revealed the bodies piled up at Buchenwald, skeletal children in Bergen-Belsen, lifeless looks in Dachau, mountains of human hair, shoes, teeth. In absolute silence, the prisoners watched, some with clenched fists, others with their eyes fixed, motionless. When the display ended, the guards said nothing. It was not necessary. The truth spoke to itself. The next day, American newspapers were distributed in the barracks. The headlines carried the same images. In some camps, Jewish veterans of the U.S. Army who had returned from Europe were invited to speak, not as avengers, but as witnesses. Most of the prisoners did not believe it immediately. Some alleged assembly, manipulation, Allied propaganda. But in the following days, letters began to arrive from Germany. Family members wrote in an enigmatic, confused tone, full of shame. A Luftwaffe officer read aloud a letter from his wife. "The pastor of our town can no longer sleep. He returned from a visit to a field. He said he saw hell. The impact was devastating, because until then, even defeated, many still held the idea that they had fought with honor, that his participation had been only military, that what happened behind the lines was the work of fanatics, and not part of a system. But now, the separation between the Wehrmacht and the SS, between battlefield and extermination camp was crumbling. The structure was one, and they had been part of it. An infantryman who had served in North Africa murmured, "And to think that we were taught that the Jew was the animal." Another, older, simply dropped the German flag he had hidden for years, not out of fear, out of disgust. The United States, which until then had won with infrastructure, with trains, with tractors, now crushed the last line of defense, morale. The enemy, who had previously been admired for efficiency, was now shamed for truth. And the most symbolic thing was not the content of the films, but the absence of comments. No narrator, no soundtrack, just the images, and the brutal realization: the lie was over. For years, Germans have been taught to believe in racial purity, moral order, cultural superiority. But what was revealed before them was the opposite. The cult of purity had become a cult of death. The order was dehumanization, superiority, an alibi for extermination. Many would never be the same again. The collapse was not only political, it was intimate, internal, silent. One prisoner wrote, "If Germany is ever reborn, let it be without this shadow." This was the hardest victory for the Americans, not the one conquered with bombs, but with the truth, not the one that destroys factories, but the one that undoes lies. Because there, in the eyes of the vanquished, for the first time, there was no more resistance. I only mourn. But one last piece of this puzzle remained, a last structure that connected everything: mass production, abundance, transportation, discipline, morals. And it was not a factory. It was an airplane. The B-29, the largest industrial weapon ever built, was about to redefine the end of the war and the beginning of a new era. In 1946, the trains now crossing Germany carried no troops or armaments. They carried silent men with different looks. It was the prisoners of war who returned home, but they were no longer the same ones who had been captured years earlier in North Africa or Italy. Those who landed in Bremerhaven or Munich no longer carried with them the ideological rigidity of 1941, but worn-out notebooks, books bound in American camps, loose sheets of calculations, maps, and carefully copied English phrases. Many of them, in the first days back, did not even know how to react to the new German world, cities in ruins, hunger, absence of authority. But there wasn't just destruction, there was space. And those returning from the Texan, Californian, or Arkansas camps were ready to fill it. A former gunnery officer, after months working at a foundry in Missouri, became a professor of thermal engineering in Munich. A former infantryman created an agricultural cooperative based on the model he had observed on Kansas farms. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "We came as Nazis. We came back as students." It was more than a metaphor. It was diagnostic. Living with American society, with its flaws, contradictions, but also its freedom and effectiveness, had reconfigured its beliefs, not by catechesis, but by contrast. The doctrine that had shaped them as soldiers of the Reich had been swallowed up by a reality that never needed to scream. Americans have never told them to think like us. They just showed what worked. And that was enough. One of the most emblematic accounts came from a former prisoner who years later became a diplomat in the FRG. At a conference, he was asked where he had learned his vision of representative democracy. The answer came dry. In Texas, inside a prison camp library. Many of the returnees became critical of the regime they had served, and not a few were directly involved in the moral reconstruction of Germany. The force that had defeated them was now the same that inspired them. A paradox impossible to predict in 1943, when they embarked as captives. There was a pattern. Those who had passed through the camps with educational programs, access to the press, books and courses, returned more adapted, more aware, more prepared. The United States, instead of simply stopping the enemy, had reprogrammed its intellectual base, not by force, but by example. An example that mixed meat on the plate, a working factory, and a free newspaper. There were no inflammatory speeches. There were results, and results educate. The transformation was not total. There were also the resentful ones. There were the indifferent. But the impact of the experiences lived in the American fields was great enough to leave lasting marks. In names, in laws, in ideas. A future Western economy minister, captured in Tunisia and sent to a camp in California, wrote that his decision to enter politics came after debating, in English, with an American guard about progressive taxation. American power did not limit itself to winning the war with bombs and tanks. He won with logistics, food, books, respect, and time. The most profound victory was that of everyday life, because an empire can impose territories, but only a civilization can transform consciousnesses. The converted mind does not rebuild itself with wreckage, but with purpose, and the prisoners returned with him. But the full impact of this silent power had not yet been revealed. The ultimate symbol was missing, not of conversion, but of total domination by scale, by technique, by the impossible-made routine. And it flew at more than 9,000 meters altitude, carrying within it the sound of the new era, the B-29 superfortress. Decades passed. The dust of war has settled. Europe has rebuilt itself, and the United States continued as a superpower. But there was something deeper than the ruins erected in concrete, the memory of those who had changed inside. In the 1980s, a low-key movement began to grow. Former German prisoners of war returned to the United States, no longer as vanquished soldiers, but as visitors in search of a past that had transformed them. They arrived with children and grandchildren. They disembarked in Houston, Chicago, New York, and went to cities they could not pronounce before. Mexia, Herne, Alva. They wanted to review the fields, to see again the men who had watched them, to see the families who had welcomed them for agricultural work, and to review, above all, the idea of humanity that they had found in a place they called the enemy. In 1985, in Texas, more than 500 former prisoners gathered for an unusual event, a ceremony of thanks. There were American veterans, former guardsmen, journalists, and onlookers, but the most moving speeches came from those who once wielded the Iron Cross. One of them, a former Wehrmacht warrant officer, took the stage in a trembling voice. "The greatest gift I received was not food, it was dignity. Here I learned that true power does not scream, he welcomes." Another, a retired farmer from Bavaria, carried an envelope with photographs. In them, young Germans picking cotton next to American children. On the back, a dedication, "To my second family, with eternal gratitude." There were stories of unlikely friendships. A prisoner helped save a farmer's daughter during an accident. Another taught German to a teacher in Arkansas. Upon returning to Germany, they kept in touch by letters for 40 years, and when they returned, they were greeted with hugs. The most iconic scene took place in Herne, where a former Luftwaffe officer walked to the grounds where the camp once stood. Today, there are only trees and wind there. But he took a sign. He buried it discreetly under an oak tree. It was written, "On this soil my war is over, and my life began." The dimension of the reunion was not only nostalgic, it was historic, because the memory of these men was not marked by suffering, but by transformation. Contrary to what many would have expected, the prisoners did not remember the camps with hatred, but with respect. They reported how they were disarmed without violence, how they were treated humanely before they even understood what that meant, and how little by little they stopped resisting the evidence that they had been deceived by their own country. In interviews with German and American newspapers, many of them admitted, "It was there that I understood what freedom means." A former prisoner who had become a historian wrote a book entitled "From the Camp to Consciousness." In it, he argued that the American victory was not only about Nazism, but about the spirit of war. That the United States had won with its factories, yes, but also with its libraries, its hospitals, its little kindnesses. Because when brute force is silent, what remains is memory. And in it, what weighs are not the weapons, but the gestures. The legacy of this experience has spanned generations. Many children of these former prisoners became professionals influenced by the values absorbed in the American camps: tolerance, efficiency, critical freedom. Some returned to study in the USA. Others worked on cooperation projects between the two countries. The war that began with weapons ended with cultural alliances. And the final irony is this: what the Reich feared so much, American degeneration, was exactly what saved its own soldiers, not because of weakness, but by moral force, because the United States, by refusing revenge and embracing re-education, has proven that true dominance is not in subjugating, but in inspiring, not in defeating by pain, but in winning by clarity. But there was still one last chapter, one last piece of data that summed it all up: the capacity of a country not only to manufacture tanks, but to manufacture the future. And to understand this greatness, one would have to look up, to the shadow that crossed the skies in 1945, carrying within it the silent conclusion of the war. At the end of the war, Nazi Germany was not only militarily crushed, it was ideologically disintegrated. The collapse came not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the grain silos of Kansas, in the factories of Detroit, on the iron rails that cut through Texas into the interior of consciousness. The doctrine of racial superiority could not resist the sound of a factory operating at midnight. The myth of German efficiency was buried under mountains of steel, tires, and food wasted by excess. And the image of a weak, materialistic, decadent America evaporated at the first sip of milk served in a clean glass to a German prisoner. The thesis proves irrefutable. It was American industrial capacity, silent, impersonal, mathematical, that dismantled the Reich from within. A war won not only with weapons but with tons of wheat, thousands of locomotives, and a moral force that did not need to justify itself. The universal lesson is this: logistics determines strategy, volume trumps tactics. The ability to maintain an uninterrupted productive system is, in itself, a form of victory. Modern warfare is not won on the battlefield. It is decided on the assembly lines, in supply decisions, in the ability to turn civilian factories into arsenals of democracy. A captured German general summed it up with coolness and resignation. "We were defeated by trucks, more trucks than we could have imagined." If you value this type of research, based on facts, archives, and forgotten testimonies, leave your like and subscribe to the channel now. This helps us to continue revealing the truth behind the myths. And comment below, what was the most shocking data you discovered in this video? Activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact we're preparing, because there are still many stories buried under the silence of the decades. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.